Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we'll get started in just a second. Okay, once again, welcome everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to post any questions you might have in the Q&A box, as we'll be dedicating some time to respond to those questions. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A recording link, as well as any resources and slides shared, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And finally, we'll be having a brief poll right towards the end of the conversation that we highly encourage you to respond to. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we start, I just want to call your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Next week on February 21st, we have an exciting double header, starting with a funder-to-funder conversation on remaking learning, philanthropic opportunities for enhancing local learning landscapes. That same day at 3 p.m., we'll have a session on remaking, I'm sorry, we have the same title there, but that same day at 3 p.m., we will have an exciting Learning Tuesdays conversation. And on February 28th, we'll have an exciting session on preventing burnout and resignation by investing in teacher coaching and support. Registration and more information for those webinars will be posted now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Hilary Jones with Foundations, Inc. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone to the fourth session in our series with New America, learning how states, districts, and educators are strengthening kindergarten. Our session today is entitled Creating Environments and Conditions for Thriving Kindergartners. And if you missed the first 3 sessions in the series, I will share the links for the YouTube recording of these sessions. But the first session was a pivotal year, kindergarten's important role in students' education. Then we talked about play plus relationships plus academics, teaching in the ways kindergartners learn best, and finally, learning how states, districts, and educators are strengthening kindergarten. And so please check out these previous sessions if you were unable to join us. But as we get started, I have the pleasure to once again introduce our moderator for the session today, Laura Bornfriend. And Laura is the Senior Fellow and Advisor on Early and Elementary Education with the Education Policy Program at New America. Laura focuses on transforming kindergarten and promoting policy and practice that will strengthen this transition into kindergarten and into the early grades of elementary school. Before joining New America over 7 years ago, Laura worked with several policy organizations in Washington, D.C., including the Institute for Educational Leadership, the Forum for Education and Democracy, and others. Laura also helped implement youth programs in the city of Orlando and was a 4th grade teacher. So Laura, once again, it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, Hilary, and thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for partnering with New America on this webinar series about transforming kindergarten. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining the discussion today. Today's webinar, as Hilary mentioned, is the 4th in this series. And we started last October with a webinar really getting into why kindergarten is such an important year in children's lives. We explored the research on building children's executive function and readying children's brains for reading. During our second webinar in November, we heard from experts about the teaching approaches that foster deep learning for kindergartners. For young students, play and meaningful relationships are essential for learning, and they need to experience more of these kinds of learning opportunities in their kindergarten classrooms. In last month's webinar, our third in the series, we heard from districts and state officials and educators about how they are working to promote and support playful learning and teaching practices that best meet the learning needs of young students. And in today's session, we will explore a number of other areas important for creating well-rounded, joyful, and engaging learning experiences for kindergartners. For most families, we know kindergarten is their child's first school experience. When teachers and administrators engage families as valued partners in learning and in the school community, it can help establish the important habits and routines for kindergartners to thrive. And when educators engage children in joyful learning, can help foster a lifelong love for learning. Kindergarten experiences set the foundation for future learning, and so we want those experiences to be positive ones. Let's jump in with our panel for today. I'm really excited about the panelists we have. And let me go ahead and introduce them, and then we will jump into a discussion. So first we have Sharisa Blanchard, who is a senior education researcher at SRI with over 24 years of experience in education, early childhood education, and early intervention. She is also an associate professor of birth through kindergarten at East Carolina University, and a partner of the Children's Equity Project. Welcome, Sharisa. We also have Hedy Chang, who is the founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative to advance student success by addressing chronic absence. Welcome, Hedy. And then we have Rebecca Colbert, the senior director of design and engagement. She leads the Early Childhood Health Outdoors initiative of the National Wildlife Federation. Welcome, Rebecca. We also have Ann Kay, who's co-founded the Minnesota nonprofit, the Rock and Read Project. She is dedicated, and the organization is dedicated to using singing to unlock children's potential for reading. Welcome, Ann. And we also have Natalie Walrond, who serves as the director of the Resilient and Healthy Schools and Communities Content Area at WestEd, and she serves as the director of the National Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety. Thank you and welcome, Natalie. I want to start our conversation by asking each of you to talk about a component of the classroom environment or enabling condition needed for children to really thrive in kindergarten. Hedy, let's start with you. Your work at Attendance Work has been essential for elevating the issues of chronic absenteeism and what they mean for children and schools.
Thank you so much, Laura, and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading and Foundation Sync for having me join. Let's go to the next slide. As you mentioned, Laura, what happens when kids are in kindergarten is absolutely essential. Whether or not it's positive or negative lays a foundation for what happens later. Does it create trust and engagement? Especially given this is the first time families might be sharing their child, sharing the raising of their child, sharing learning and helping their child thrive with another person who's not a family member, especially now during the pandemic, when so many kids actually haven't gone to preschool, much less than in years before the pandemic. So kindergarten is more essential as that routine place. And what we believe is that having those positive conditions of learning are then essential to having that meaningful first experience. Do families feel physically, emotionally healthy and safe? Do they feel a sense of belonging, connection, support? Is what their experience in learning academically challenging and engaging? And are they surrounded by adults and students who have the well-being so they can invest in those relationships that make these positive conditions possible? And when you see high levels of chronic absence, like we are seeing now, it's a sign that there is a deep erosion of these conditions. If you go to the next slide, this is data from California. Last year, by the end of last year, 40% of our kindergartners were chronically absent. And it was worse in some communities. Our African-American kids, our Native American kids, half of them, almost half of our Latino and Hispanic kids, almost 60% of Pacific Islanders. So you're seeing these high levels overall as a state, and then for particular groups who've already experienced historical issues of equity and inequity, rather. Next slide. And California is not alone. If you look at data from Ohio, you see similarly incredibly high levels of kindergarten chronic absence. Gets better and then gets worse. But that pivotal first year experience is, this is just distressing and disturbing. And then if you go to the next slide, this is Connecticut data. And Connecticut data, they're actually a little less high than the rest of other states. But if you look at it, because we keep thinking, oh, that when we showed back up to school this year, because the pandemic wasn't as big of an issue, that things would turn back to normal. And that darker blue bar, sorry, I think we missed some demographics, some of we'll fix the slide by the time you guys get it, but the 34% is what we saw this fall. So it hasn't gone down, it's actually gone up in Connecticut. And Connecticut, which has invested in lots of resources, also has some of the best and most accurate data. So I want to go back to those positive conditions of learning for a second. What this suggests is that if we want our kindergartners to thrive, we have to take a very intentional approach to investing in these positive conditions for learning. And certainly we know that the triple threat, COVID, flu, and RSV have been challenging, but we also know transition anxiety separation anxiety rather, was an issue for kindergartners even before the pandemic. And now, when kids feel nervous and their families feel nervous, kids will feel that. Kids will say, I've got a stomach ache. I don't feel like going to school. It's always been one of the challenges in kindergarten to help families understand what's anxiety versus what's real illness that requires you staying home. Because if it's anxiety, then the key is actually getting them back into that routine of showing up to school. And we know when kids feel engaged, when they feel connected to their peers, to adults, when their families feel connected to the adults in the school, when kids feel the joy of learning, engagement of learning, then they're more likely to want to feel less anxious, and to want to show up every day. And we've had kids, kindergarten through second grade, who've had such sporadic learning, such challenges of being in that routine, that now more than ever, we have to get kids back into a regular routine of learning, because we know showing up to school is what will enable them to benefit from what's in school and thrive in these early years. So back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Hetty. And I really think the idea that a good or bad experience in kindergarten sets that foundation for, the following grades is an important one, and something that, we all need to keep in mind. And really that good experience can set children up to thrive, but a bad one will alienate, children and families. And I see on, your slide here that there's a point about adult well-being. And so I want to come back later during our discussion to what adults need, for them to really engage in positive relationships with children and their families. So we'll come back to that question. But now I want to bring in Sharissa. And, Sharissa, I want to ask you, what do education leaders need to be doing to prepare environments to help families really feel welcome in schools, and help children, feel that they're a valued part of the classroom community and the school community?
Yes, thank you, Hilary and Laura, Campaign for Grade Level Reading and New America, for inviting me. I love that Hetty came back to the reference of the importance of relationships and connection for positive learning conditions. We know that they're both a huge part of positive environments and having thriving kindergartners. And when we think about environments, we're considering so many different things. In no particular order, we think about the physical space, what is in the space, what's on the walls. We think about the content and the curriculum and materials. We think about the daily structure, such as how much are children sitting and what kind of physical activity occurs, what kind of meals are served. We think about who is in the environment, the people in the environment, from the early educators and teachers and administrators to the building and classroom support people. And we also think about how the children and families feel in the environment, or the ambiance of the environment. All these things are important, even in virtual spaces, and fostering belonging, and they're truly important. Next slide, Pete, please. I want to go a little bit farther beyond the areas I mentioned on the previous slide to think about this framework where we're connecting culturally responsive pedagogy and critical cultural competence. It's like a mouthful, but there's 4 things I want to pull out of these 2 concepts. First is that when you think about culturally responsive educators, they're not colorblind. Culturally responsive educators reject the concept and realize that it's harmful. They consider their own cultural background and how it can limit understanding of students, and they value students' strengths and incorporate students' language and culture into teaching. Also, you think about cultural conflict and being able to recognize that the vast majority of students and families and teaching interactions should be informed by this focus. Sorry, my cat's jumping up here. And this focus on language, examples, and being intentional, and that language has power, and to be explicit in how you assist students in being successful. The next piece is rejecting meritocracy and recognizing that institutional and structural barriers do exist historically and currently, and that they result in the fact that not everyone who works hard gets what they want and is able to be successful. So you provide content and support to students to be successful and support students and families, and pushing back against inequitable structures. And culturally responsive educators also reject deficit ideas and don't allow them to influence their beliefs and practices, value students' identities, and treat students equitably, and go beyond traditional teaching strategies to be inclusive and intentional and involve children and families. These areas are really areas of focus in individual work. And if you go to the next slide, this is just another framework to think about for our early childhood educators. And I really want to stress the piece about families here in relationships, communicating with families, respecting parents and caregivers' views, and having knowledge and respect for families' perspectives on caregiving and everything else. The next slide goes a little bit deeper into the self-awareness piece and thinking about yourself, examples of questions that you might think about to know yourself better, what resonates with you about your identity. And the next slide are just questions to think about for your own self-awareness. So it starts with ourselves, but then thinking about how we interact with the environment and children and families. We go on to the last slide. I just want to finish with an example of that skillfully weaves culture and curriculum and belonging. There was a study done by Gilliard and Moore in 2007, and they worked with 8 early educators on the Flathead Indian Reservation, and they asked the question, how does the culture of the family and community shape curriculum? And what was really interesting about this study is that the educators on this reservation said that they didn't focus specifically on culture, that they really focused on respect and understanding the children and families that they were working with. They felt that it was extremely important to honor rituals and beliefs and routines. And 3 themes came out of this research: respect of children, families, and community, building a sense of belongingness and community through ritual, and the importance of family values and beliefs. And then I'll just share one excerpt from the study. One of the things I do notice is that every tribe has the drum as the center of their music and dancing. And I didn't realize when I first started teaching how much it draws people into the circle, and it does. The drum is the heartbeat, and it does draw children in. So this is just one example of thinking about really centering children and their families and their culture, and how being intentional really matters in developing and fostering belonging. I'll pass it back to Laura.
Thank you, Sharissa, for really laying out the importance of understanding and respecting where children and families are coming from and what they bring to the classroom, and how to value that. I love this diagram that brings really together culture, curriculum, and belonging. So we'll talk more about later the opportunities and barriers to doing some of this. But I want to bring in Rebecca, and I know Sharissa started out with a question that kind of stuck with me around how long are children sitting, and which I know sometimes can be a long time. And I know that much of your work with the National Wildlife Federation is with pre-K programs and early childhood programs, but there are really a lot of similarities, and we want to see a lot of similarities between good practices in pre-K and good practices in kindergarten. So can you talk about why outdoor learning is important for young learners? Oh, we can't hear you, Rebecca.
Of course, because we're how many years into Zoom every day. But sorry, let me start over. So absolutely, I'd love to speak on this topic, and thank you so much for having me here today, Laura. As you mentioned, in early childhood education, the importance of that child-led play-based learning is widely embraced. I mean, I think we can all acknowledge when we spend a little time with a toddler that they're not meant to sit still and be quiet for long. They have that innate drive to explore the world around them with all of their senses and their full, curious, loud, active selves. And that inherent curiosity doesn't simply go away when a child reaches age 4 or 5 and is now ready to enter kindergarten. So we suddenly have new expectations for what learning looks like in an elementary school setting. And a lot of that is preparing to learn in a way that we're expecting of someone much older, a 10-year-old at age 5, at grade 5. So what we really want to do is harness that sense of energy, or that energy and that sense of wonder that we nurture in early childhood, and continue to engender that, because it's such a really strong motivational force for learning. And it sets an important foundation for the physical, mental, and emotional health across the full lifespan, really. And what we know is that access to diverse, naturalized settings that support outdoor play and learning really increase opportunities for rich, embodied experiences that engage the whole child in the many ways, and providing the many benefits that are shown in this diagram. Next slide, please. Though we often in elementary school think of the outdoor environment solely as a place to burn off steam or to get exercise during recess between our lessons, that is one benefit of outdoor space. And obviously we can be more active and more physical outdoors. And there's really a complementary effect with classroom learning. We know that active kids learn better. So when they're back in the classroom, they're more receptive to those lessons. Teachers are dealing with fewer behavioral problems and all of that. But one thing that we know is that the settings that we typically provide for recess at school, on school grounds, our fixed play equipment and a field, maybe tetherball, a few court games, they tend to engage a portion of children in physical activity for a short length of time. But they're not very inclusive of the many diverse ways that kids are outdoors, and neurodiversity and demands from different kids who might be interested in different types of activities. And we find that kids quickly become bored with the static opportunities that are available in their school grounds, and that often leads to conflict and behavioral challenges. So what we know, though, is that time outdoors is very complementary to learning. And when we provide rich and diverse outdoor play and learning settings, we can achieve both physical activity and the cognitive benefits that sustain our academic lessons indoors. So if we go to the next slide, just a demonstration of how a more formal classroom can come outdoors and be a setting, especially we feel like people leaned into this a lot more during COVID, spaces to be outdoors and do some of the things we do indoors, like a reading lesson, but also really taking the advantage of the natural setting as an inspiration for children. So can you do a nature scavenger hunt that also reinforces letter sounds? Can you hunt for letters or sounds in the environment? So literacy can really be supported, and kids can be inspired to tell stories about what they're seeing and experiencing in the outdoor setting. Go to the next slide. We find that natural loose parts can serve as manipulatives for those early math lessons, for identifying shapes in the outdoor environment. We can even bring those things that we collect in so that students can continue to manipulate those natural elements, just as we would the little math counters that we use in the classroom and different stations in our classroom settings. And art, of course, is a beautiful thing to do with natural materials that's very inspiring for kids. So we can learn about shape and form and color and texture and all of those things in kindergarten that we're starting to introduce more richly in an outdoor environment. And then the next slide. And another important piece is, a lot of the STEAM learning that's so critical in our curriculum these days. These experiments can be better done in a natural setting. So can we talk about cold and hot? Can we talk about weather? Can we talk about water and how it behaves? Can we talk about how sound is made? All of these things in an environment that's very inviting and feels very much more comfortable and home-like than a lesson that would happen in an indoor classroom. And then the next slide, I think, really brings to the forefront something that's really so critical for our young children, especially coming out of the pandemic. Nature is a healing place. Many of our kids are coming into school for the first time, having experienced adverse childhood experiences. They may be dealing with trauma, stemming from home or interaction with other children. And nature is a holding environment and a healing space for children to self-regulate, to reduce stress, to take a moment to reset and be ready to learn. And we find that that's very supportive both for students, but also for teachers. There's a need for teachers to be able to have that moment of taking a deep breath outdoors throughout the day that can really sustain teaching in the classroom and support mental and emotional health. On the next slide, too, we just want to reinforce that some of the pieces that others have spoken about today on the call already, that sense of belonging, that sense of connectedness and safety that we want to feel in kindergarten, so that families have a sense that they belong there, that this is a place that supports diverse people with many backgrounds. Sometimes inviting families into a classroom setting can be intimidating, but we find when we invite families to build days in gardens, for instance, we see a totally different set of parents show up. There's just a totally different kind of comfort level that comes with being outdoors, involved with your hands in nature, than comes from a classroom experience for many families. So we see it as embracing the diversity, the neurodiversity, cultural diversity of the families who are coming to us, maybe as their first experience in a school setting. And just to wrap up, for my slides, this is one reason that ECHO as a program exists. We really see that time in nature is a right for children, that we should be providing nature experiences to every child every day, for the health of individual children, but also for our communities and our planet overall. I'll pass it back to you, Laura.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I love how you really brought in so many examples of how to engage children in learning outdoors, from literacy to math and, you know, science, and just bringing in those natural materials. It really seems like ways to create joyful learning experiences for children and for families. So thank you. And Anne, I want to bring you into our conversation now. We know that you are a former music teacher and have done research on how music and singing are important for early literacy. And I know that there's a lot of you know, literacy learning that happens in kindergarten, and you know, a lot of teachers incorporate song and singing into that. But can you talk more about what you've been doing in Minnesota, and really how singing can be an important tool for literacy learning?
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to GLR and New America. And we'll start with the first slide there. Well, that was the next one. Yes. So we're a Minnesota nonprofit, and one of our favorite slogans here is "Sing today, read forever." Most people do not connect singing with reading. And so I'm bringing you the latest neuroscience, which was the next slide. In the last 10 years, there's been a burgeoning amount of neuroscience about brain research. And so these are the effects of singing and music making on brain development. So most preschools and kindergartens have music making, but we may not know all the benefits. And so one benefit is that it's the one activity that can stimulate cognitive, sensory, motor, and reward systems all at the same time. So we're talking about an active, bodies on, hands on environment for children. So they're singing the day away, they're keeping a steady beat, anytime we hear music, it activates the physical part of our brains, they're moving, and the reward system, it's fun, it's motivating. And so in addition to that, it enables auditory processing and auditory memory. Singing and music making improves neural encoding of speech, and that's a precursor up to pre-literacy, foundational skill in the brain. It allows babies to acquire language earlier. It develops beat synchronization. Most people do not know that the ability to keep a steady beat is highly correlated with reading. In other words, if children can't keep a steady beat, the underlying pulse of music, or with a metronome tick, 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 they are likely to struggle with reading. They're essential brain functions, and they're developed by natural behavior we call singing and music making. Next slide. So we had $600,000 in Minnesota. We funded a state project, 5-year project, and this was the largest year of our project. We had 150 4th and 5th graders at 9 schools use a singing-based software program, and they got rewarded for singing in tune and in rhythm. Now, these were 2nd through 5th graders, but most of the schools put children on the program who were not proficient in reading. In other words, they were does not meet proficiency on our state standard or our state test. After 13.5 hours of singing songs repeatedly and getting rewarded for better rhythmic and melodic accuracy, students go up on average 1 year in reading achievement. Pretty dramatic. These students went up 1/3 of them went up a level from does not meet to partly meets. And the interesting thing at these 9 schools were the 500 4th and 5th graders at those schools who were not put on that singing program did not significantly go up in levels. And so what that tells us that in a very short period of time of singing and music making or rhythmic singing, we have a dramatic improvement. And to us, that's probably it's brain development, but we can't see in the brain. You can go on to the next slide. But there are researchers. One is internationally known now at Northwestern University, Dr. Nina Kraus, who studies the brains of children before they even enter school. So here's a little 3-year-old guy and neural nets on his brain. They don't study MRI where the brain systems light up. They are studying frequency following response, FFR. And that shows how on a number of different, like 8 different quadrants, how a brain processes sound. And what they've found is they can predict whether this child is going to struggle with reading by the way they process sound. So we say that sound processing is the key to literacy, language acquisition and literacy. And next slide. So at Rock and Read, we talk about being musically fit by age 5. And that means bodies on, voices on, moving to the beat, patting the beat, clapping the rhythm of the words of a chant or song, hearing different pitches and being able to tell if they're higher or lower, matching a pitch with the voice and singing in tune. Now, there's no data saying you have to sing in tune to read fluently, but it couldn't hurt. And I don't think there's been a lot of research about it. So children with basic musical skills are not only going to be better readers, they're going to be happier. They're going to be highly motivated. They're going to be active. And music making is a natural human behavior. So last slide, I think it is, in Minnesota. Oh, sorry, we have developed a basic musical fitness assessment. I couldn't find anything out there. And so we're piloting this in kindergartens and in preschools. And it's just what we just talked about, musically fit by age 5. Can the child keep a beat? Can they clap the rhythm? Can they sing in tune? Whatever. And we're assessing that and we're comparing it to letter sound acquisition. And the last slide is Minnesota. We're launching what I call a quiet disruption, zap the gap in reading. We think we could get all children reading proficiently, help all children be ready to read proficiently, I should say, by enabling their brains through singing, moving, and developing basic music skills, like keeping a steady beat and whatever. So we're working with legislators to fund a program that would, state funded, that would provide parents with this science about brain development and reading, singing strategies, the assessment, and then we've written a curriculum called A Song a Day, Brain Prep for Pre-Readers, which we are now piloting in schools with children. 50 sequence lessons that use music making. We want to know, do they enable the brain's auditory processing, phonological awareness, auditory memory, and then beat synchronization, or the ability to keep the steady beat. I think that's it, Laura.
Thank you, Anne. And I look forward to talking more in our discussion a little later about just educators and how educators can be ready to really engage children with music in the classroom. So thank you. Natalie, I'm going to bring you in now. Can you help us connect the dots across what we've heard? We've heard a lot of different areas, but they are interrelated. We've heard a little bit about how they connect, but really, what does the science of learning and development say about the kinds of environments and experiences kindergartners need, and what does that mean for everything we have heard just before you? Thanks.
Laura, thank you so much. And I have to apologize. I meant to put myself on mute and I cleared my throat right in the middle of your speaking. I'm so sorry about that. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And as Laura mentioned, I get the very fun role of sharing the research and evidence base behind the work that a lot of our fabulous presenters are sharing and talk about the through lines and ideas. And I'm looking at the time and I'm going to move relatively quickly because I think we're going to want to make sure we have a lot of time for Q&A. So if we could skip through maybe the next slide and then go to the one with the 4 boxes. Right. So I had the benefit of getting to see everybody's slides ahead of time. And so these are the 4 through lines and everything that you heard that I was able to identify that I wanted to share with you all. So they are the science of learning and development, which you may know people shorten to say to be SOLD. The idea of equity, the idea of authentic family engagement, and the idea of multidisciplinary approaches to really relevant, rigorous learning. So let's start at the top left with the science of learning and development, and we can go to the next slide here. Sold describes the synthesis of a body of research from neuroscience and all kinds of different scientific disciplines about how learning and development happens prenatal through adulthood, just by virtue of being human beings. And there's two big ideas that I want to start with, and let's start on the right, which is the idea that learning is integrated. So research in science describes 4 domains of learning and development. They are social, emotional, cognitive, and physiological. And early childhood researchers often add in a 5th, which is language acquisition. And the big idea is that these domains develop in integrated ways. So strength in one actually bolsters the others, and struggles in one can limit the others. So as Rebecca said in her presentation, you might remember, she said, active kids learn better. And there's a science behind that, right? The second idea is learning is contextual. So Sold reminds us that learning and brain development involves a continuous interactive process of experimentation and trial and error between a person and their environment. And an environment is both the space and the relationships. So learning happens when we test new ideas, when we make connections. Our brain synapses and ultimately our brain structure actually form through the experiences that we have with our relationships and our environments, and are really significant factors in how we learn and develop. So this brings us back to the theme of the webinar, right? It is the responsibility of us as the adults to create the conditions and the context through environments and relationships in which every member of the learning community, the young people and the adults, can thrive. I want to end this piece with just sort of saying that this process of experimentation and trial and error and curiosity and exploration, it's natural and it's instinctive. And in our youngest learners, it looks like play, right? So I'm going to move quickly through the next 2 boxes. So if you go to the next slide, there is this idea of equity. And I just want to lift up that we've heard all of our presenters in some way talk about equity. The next natural question that you have when you understand the science of learning and development is who our conditions are serving well and who's getting left behind. So I'm not going to go through all of this tiny font on this slide. This is really just an illustration for our center of how we talk about what it looks like in practical purposes to do this work with equity at the center. And what I'll lift up is when you're doing this work with equity at the center, you are celebrating strengths and attending to needs and honoring the highest aspirations of young people, taking a strengths-based approach, not a deficit approach. Beginning the work with an inquiry stance rather than jumping to assumptions and judgment, and co-creating with families and communities and valuing the cultural wealth that they bring. So I think about Sharice's presentation here as well. And I'm going to just drop into the chat. This is a brief that our center authored a while back about just a little self-reflection in your practice about making sure that you're doing this work with equity at the center. The next slide is about authentic family engagement as a through line in everything that you've heard from all of the speakers. And really, I just want to point to the piece about how, right? Like when we heard the speakers talking about authentic family engagement, what we heard about was working with families in partnership, not as families as being something that needs to be fixed. And then the slide after that is really about multidisciplinary approaches, right? Oh, sorry, we just did that one. And then we'll go to the next one. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just clicking through this, I know. So the big idea here is that when you think about the nexus of playful learning and safe, supportive, and responsive relationships and environments, and then equitable mindsets and practices and policies and systems, the nexus of that is the creation of these fertile conditions in which young children can thrive. And I want to offer, there's certainly many ways to do this work, but offer performance-based education or project-based learning as one pedagogical approach that achieves this. So there's this fabulous organization called PBL Works, and they describe project-based learning as a teaching method in which students learn by actively engaging in real world and personally meaningful projects. And hopefully you've seen examples of that in the presentation so far. Project-based learning is an especially rich approach in kindergarten because it invites this kind of exploration and play. I am totally not watching my time here, so I'm not going to jump into any specific examples. We can share that in the Q&A if folks are interested. But project-based learning in kindergarten really creates these opportunities for academically rigorous, playful, joyful, interdisciplinary learning for young children. So if we go to the next slide, I will just share that our center has been working with state teams from 15 different states on developmentally appropriate practice and equitable kindergarten transitions. We've got a webinar coming up on March 22nd, and so we hope you will find our registration on our website and join us. And I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Laura.
Thanks, Natalie. And I'm going to come back to you later for some examples if you have them. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And thanks to all of you for your presentations. And I want to invite you back to turn on your cameras now so we can jump into a discussion. And I want to, one thing that all of you mentioned was it led me to think about educators and adults and what they need to be able to do what you talked about well. I'm thinking about, engaging families in building good habits around attendance, engaging children and families in, their culture and what's important to them and what, parents want for their children in learning, just to do outdoor experiences. I mean, I could go on, but what do the adults in the building really need to be able to create the kinds of environments you're talking about? Hetty, I see your hand up.
Thanks. So, Laura, I wanted to start with one of the things I think it's a mindset issue. And particularly with the issue of attendance, the problem is people come in with blame. It's not even being open-minded. It's starting by not being judgmental and blaming. And especially when we're talking about working across racial divides, maybe we have perceptions of what other people are. We have lots of judgments. We have biases in our brain. And particularly what we see is when kids miss school, especially because we also have a long history of truancy laws where they're like, if you don't show up to school, I'm not going to ask, hey, are you okay? What happened? How can I help? I'm going to say, hey, get to school or else. And I'm going to threaten you with, legal sanctions, taking to your court, which, believe me, does not start a positive, engaging partnership where you either understand what the family is concerned about, because sometimes it's even something in the classroom that's maybe pushing the kid's bullied, the kid's not engaging, the kid's not, that the teacher might need to understand, or something outside that they're not, that they actually are worried about and concerned about and maybe embarrassed about and not willing to share. But unless you can't actually address. And I think this follows to also with even how we partner around learning in the home and in the school and how we do complementary. We tend to come in with judgment and blame rather than let me stop, build a relationship, find out about the hopes and dreams that a family has, figure out what their assets, what they can bring to that, what I can bring to that, and come up with different kinds of solutions. And that's why things like parent-teacher home visiting is such an incredible asset, because it requires teachers to go into homes, to open up, to hear firsthand what families are thinking and establish a relationship. So then you can think about building upon that. And so I think it's changing our mindsets is where this starts.
Yeah, I agree. Natalie, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, Hetty, I so appreciate your comments. I think, it speaks absolutely to this idea of starting with inquiry, right? Before you start judging families. I wanted to speak to the piece about what teachers need. There is this wonderful research that I found that I wanted to share with you by Elaine Allensworth. She wrote this article in 2014 about work that she had done with adolescents to understand what they needed from their relationships with teachers, right? And in the article, she says, it's easy to assume that adolescents want easygoing and likable, but in fact, they're looking for something different. And it's relevant here because at the end of the article that she wrote, she talks about the fact that they then did a follow-up study with what teachers need from their school leaders. And it was exactly parallel. And so there was this idea of positive, healthy relationships for the adults in schools. Looks like three things she found: setting clear expectations and communicating goals consistently, monitoring progress, and then reaching out when needed and being willing to listen to understand. So this idea of when we talk about responsive developmental relationships for our young people, we actually need to make sure we're creating those same conditions for the adults as well.
Thanks, Natalie. Rebecca?
I mean, I would say around engaging children outdoors, we need to lean into a culture of yes. So when a teacher is inspired to take learning outdoors in a way that might not be the norm within a school, that there aren't so many barriers around no because of risk and no because of we need a permission slip from everyone, but finding ways to, problem solve that together and to embrace those creative ways of engaging children that they see as being successful for their own classroom. I know that a lot of the images that I showed demonstrate entire sites that have been transformed to support outdoor learning. And I think, sometimes we have that in mind, that it has to be all or nothing with outdoor learning, but really there are small incremental things that teachers can do, even just taking a walk around the block of the school and observing the changes in seasons, or using your listening for bird sounds and having a conversation about that. There's so many small things that I think we can say yes to on a more regular basis than we're willing to. So I feel like a lot of strong support for teachers who want to try something a little bit out of the ordinary, because they know that their kids need some movement and a shift in perspective and a change in setting, and they see that that's a successful way to get through to kids who may not be as receptive to classroom learning every day, day in and day out.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rebecca. And I know that when we were at more of the height or at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that my first thought went to, like, why don't we embrace the outdoors and be able to create opportunities for kids to continue learning in school settings, but in the outdoors. And I think, not just when, to avoid sickness, but there's just so many ways to use the outdoors, whether you're in a city or a rural environment. I think there's lots of opportunity there. Sharissa, I saw that your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, to kind of pull together some of the things we've been talking about. Many of our ways of being are deeply seated and deeply rooted in a lot of different biases, and just sometimes how we were raised or how we interacted when we were students. And so I think that, it takes a lot of time and effort to build these relationships. And so if we spend that time to build the relationships and get to know the children and families, oftentimes we can develop more empathy in our relationships and ask some of the questions that Hetty mentioned, and I think maybe Natalie and Rebecca too. It takes a lot of listening and engaging and doing things differently. And so it definitely takes time, and sometimes we just want to plow right through and make assumptions, and that definitely has gotten us into the situation we're in now in many of our schools and communities. And so I think doing things differently is important.
Thanks for that. And I want to stick with barriers a little bit, because I hear you, all mentioning, mindsets and potential just ways of thinking and, biases that we all have and that, bring to our work. But, what are maybe other barriers to doing some of these things, doing things differently? I know certainly, educators in the classroom are under a lot of pressure because of different mandates and time. And, how do we address, what are the barriers, and, what are some ways to address them?
Laura, I would offer up one challenge is, I think, we don't structure in relationship building into how our schools are organized. And I think there's several kinds of ways we don't structure it. We don't structure in time for school staff or partners to connect with kids or with families on a regular way. So if, as Teresa said, the key to this is relationship over time. It's not like I talk once to Teresa and go, I know everything about her. I talk to Teresa once a week for 8 weeks. Now I might actually have a clue. And so whether that's your advisory, whether that's how you, I think about how you build in time in the beginning of the school day so that families, when they're dropping off, might even just say hello, or when they're picking up through their expanded learning. Then there's also the cross-planning time. And I was thinking about this, Rebecca, when my kids, so sorry, this is not research-based, but I did all this stuff because when Ralph asked me to look at chronic absence, my kids were in a very mixed income elementary school. One of the kids in my kids' class was a little boy who was born the same day as my kid, was struggling with poverty. His mom died when they were in second grade. Really challenging experience. But one of the things I was thinking about it was, at the time, we had a school garden, and Rebecca, the school garden coordinator, had this partnership with the teachers, because this poor kid, he's 7 years old, lost his mom, would take him out to the garden and have him hang out, and he just needed healing time. Now, I also think at the school, we didn't have all the supports to create a real support system for this kid. So we actually we did a little bit right and some that didn't. And this was actually the motivation for my own work. But part of this was because we didn't have the relationships to follow up, to support, but also to always think about how do we leverage all parts of a school experience to support kids who we know are struggling. And we haven't organized schools to operate this way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, like building time into the schedule to really rethink how we're delivering kindergarten, how we're delivering education, how parents or educators are engaging with parents. It's reframing really the education. And Rebecca, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Hetty's very touching story. I think, another way that we see outdoor spaces really leveraged in an equitable and beneficial way in schools is by those who are coming in for intervention. So physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, in the case where they can take children out into these settings in a one-on-one or, small group engagement, and really work on some of those real life situation skills that are so critical to also providing the scaffold for learning, right? So we see sometimes that kids who are challenged with either this trauma that comes with life for many kids, or have physical or other types of conditions that disable them in certain ways, that certain strengths come forward in diverse settings. That, we had an educator share with us that they have a nonverbal student, but when they go outside, they suddenly open up with these different ways of communicating and pointing, and it just lights up certain pathways for learning that aren't there indoors. And I think it opens hearts in certain ways too, like as Hetty mentioned with this child who just needs that holding time in nature to heal. And I think seeing a whole child is really critical to all of that, because children are going to come to educators with every lived experience. They are their full selves. They don't know, they haven't learned as adults to have your work self and your home self, right? They're the whole person. And so we need to be able to support that whole person thriving both in the classroom, but as small humans in the world as well. So I think that's really key to a lot of the threads that we're hearing in this conversation.
And I was going to come to you. I don't know if you're going to answer what I was going to ask, but I was just going to note that, I'm betting the same is true when we're thinking about music and using music in ways to engage, children differently. And so you can speak to that or just bring in the point that you were going to make.
Well, I'm quite concerned about the mindset when we're talking about why children are absent, why they don't want to go to school. And all these reasons are really important. But to me, it's like I always think when I'm teaching children or teaching teachers about teaching children, it's what is magnetic, what is compelling, what is going to make that child say, I can't miss today. It's the relationships, it's active, being outside, and it's making music. Music is in every culture. Every culture sings, every culture dances. And what we see in schools is that it disappears by kindergarten. I mean, they might be singing Itsy Bitsy Spider at 4 years old, but in kindergartens, what we're seeing in Minnesota is they're very serious. It's a lot of paper pencil, kids are at their desks. And the mindset is, and there's fear about if we let go of that, if we go outside, oh no, we're wasting time. If we're singing, we're wasting time. I've had teachers tell me, I'm worried. I have to take time away from my kindergarten, the curricula. And so to me, the current mindset cannot be solved. This is grade level reading here today. And I'm just going to say our current mindset that our national reading problem could be solved by pushing 5-year-olds to read goes against the science of helpful brain development and is not working if over 2/3 of 4th and 8th graders are not proficient in reading. And so the developmental science about young children is they need to move and create and we call it play, but it's really essential. It's fun, it's motivating, but teachers are under the impression they can't do it. I only have this much time, and I'm saying you cannot not do it. So we've got quite a bit of fear about letting go of the curricula that are in place, and I especially like outdoor learning. Oh no time for that. Singing, no. So we try to weave singing in between, greeting song, and that's about relationship. If a child is greeted by name in song, in movement every time they come, the transitions are in singing, the directions are in singing. One of the neat pieces of latest research is young children were more attentive when their parents sang to them, the mother, it was a study of mothers, when the mothers sang to them than when they spoke to them. Children love rhythm, rhyme, and repetition, and it makes them want to come to school. What's compelling? So that's how I look at it, from the child center, the relationships of the child, the parents, and what kind of music you're using. I mean, this is all very important, but that child has to be active to want to come to school.
Yeah.
Thanks. That was long.
Thanks, yeah. Teresa.
Yeah, I was just thinking about as we were preparing for this panel, and I shared the example of my daughter. And I do think that fear of change is just really important in this conversation, but we do sometimes have laws and barriers in that way that prevent teachers from doing things that they really want to do, where they feel that the laws are preventing them. But I talked about the example of my daughter when she started kindergarten. She was in a developmentally based preschool program where she played and she ran and she spent so much time outside, and she heard about kindergarten and it was like, you know, built up because her older brothers were in kindergarten. They were in grade school by then. And she's like, kindergarten is going to be this great and wonderful place. And I was able to get a snapshot in the local newspaper of us walking in that first day of kindergarten, holding hands. And she's looking up at me and I'm looking down at her. And it was a wonderful picture of the photographer that took of us smiling at each other. And I looked at that picture not too long ago. She's in 6th grade now, and thought about how excited she was that kindergarten, I'm getting to kindergarten, and it's going to be even better than preschool was. And then a few weeks into it, the sadness that came with her reflecting on the fact that, Mom, we just sit, like we sit all day, like we don't get to play a lot, you know, where she was running around so much, she was playing. And, you know, it was just sad to me that after so many years and so many decades of us thinking about and talking about, at least in my circles, about ready schools, I had to send her to a place where they were wonderful educators. Don't get me wrong. I'm trained as a teacher. I know that the job is challenging, but it just broke my heart that in kindergarten there was going to be so different from preschool, and that she would be writing so much and sitting so much and not as active. And so the research does not support this, though. And we know that research supports what Anne is saying and what Rebecca's saying and what all of you are saying, that we need to do something differently. And listen, it's not working the way it is. Think about our attendance and think about what's happening. And so I think the time to think about reframing is here, and making sure that it's compelling, as Anne said. What is compelling about the day of a kindergartner? I don't know.
That's a great question. And, you know, we know, as you said, we have the research backing that something different needs to happen in kindergarten classrooms. But we also know that, you know, welcoming families, valuing and sustaining, you know, children's culture so they want to be in school, providing enriching outdoor learning opportunities, integrating music and movement, integrating social and emotional learning. These things aren't impossible, and there are places where they're happening. So I want to kind of shift a little bit and talk about, you know, where are the promising places that we can look to, whether it's at a state level, a district, or a local school. Where can we look to as places working through the barriers? I know you all have some examples.
I will jump in. So as I mentioned when I was speaking, the center that I direct, we are facilitating a really lovely collaborative right now called Transforming Kindergarten. And we are getting to work with state leaders from a variety of agencies from 15 different states who are thinking about this idea of developmentally appropriate practice and equitable kindergarten transitions. And I would imagine that none of them would say, oh, we've got it all figured out, which is why I paused a little bit with this question. Like, I don't know that any of them would say we're the exemplar, but we have certainly seen states like Nevada thinking about how they create the conditions at the state level that supports district level work, that supports building work, that supports classroom work, that vertical alignment and coherence. And we've seen states like Hawaii think about how they find an entry point. In their case, it's around co-creating a vision for kindergarten and kindergarten entry assessments to really inspire capacity building around developmentally appropriate practice and playful learning. We know Mississippi is thinking a lot about kindergarten transitions and making sure that, and Massachusetts as well, they're in conversation about how do you create a transition that is equitable so that regardless of your learning environment, you are coming in ready to thrive in the right conditions. So I don't know that I'm being as specific as you might have hoped, Laura, but I think there's a lot of amazing work that's happening with system leaders right now to create the conditions for joyful learning in kindergarten.
No, I think that's great to bring up, because another question, if we have time, that I'll ask is, what do you think states can do to be supportive of this work? But are there other examples? They might not be best practice or perfect examples, but I think that there's a lot of places that are working to address some of the challenges that we've discussed.
I'll say that I think we do find that kindergartens that are attached to early childhood programs tend to stay a little more on the play-based side and leverage their outdoor time in a different way than maybe those that are in a K through 12 kind of setting. Just from an approach, we see outdoor play being embraced a little more in Montessori teaching and some other approaches, sometimes in our charter settings here. I'm in Denver. But I think that there are individual champions who take on outdoor play and learning in all different kinds of settings, because we tend to see that you can run the gamut from simple activities that are easier to incorporate, like taking that walk around the block or bringing in some loose parts, those sorts of things, all the way to transforming a full setting, which, we talked earlier about barriers a little bit, Laura, but often districts feel concerned about how they can afford to sustain an outdoor learning environment when they don't even have the staff to keep their restrooms up to speed or things like that. There's a question about resource and how it's allocated. We see good outcomes when there are partnerships in a community. So gardening organizations who will sustain or maintain outdoor environments in partnership with schools, co-managed sites between park districts and schools, things like that. So some of it's thinking about collaboration in a way that's a little more out of the box, so that some of those resources can go a little further. I would say some of the other, barriers and ways that people are overcoming that. We have heard a lot recently, obviously, about resource going to infrastructure and going to climate resilient strategies. And we see the settings that children spend all day, every day in, some from birth, all the way, through their school years, need to be healthy and sustaining environments that, support physical health, environmental health. And so we're seeing some initiatives that overlap climate resilience strategies with healthy school strategies, so that we're looking at things like shade equity on school playgrounds and things like that. California, for instance, at the statewide level, has started a school forestry initiative where it's about greening schoolyards, but it's also about bringing shade and reducing air pollution around school settings. So there's some creative approaches that look at beyond whole child health, whole planet health, and how schools and educational settings fit into that spectrum.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sharissa, you want to jump in?
Yes, I'll just make one quick comment. There's an educator here in Eastern North Carolina, and I'm blanking on her name. I'll have to find it and get it to you. But she was a graduate from our birth through kindergarten program, and she came back and shared some of her experience, and she became really well known as a top teacher in her community. And she struggled with having a play-based environment in kindergarten because it wasn't respected or it wasn't valued by administration. And so while she was successful in doing that, it was very stressful, I would say, for her because it wasn't supported. She had to prove really that this way worked. And she did end up proving that. So I do think there is something to be said. Karen mentioned this in the chat, and I think others have said, we need to have administration and people at the state level who support this so that teachers can do the job that they need to do and not have to prove that having a play-based or developmentally appropriate environment and way that they're doing things is what's right for kids.
Yeah, okay. Hetty, last word on this, and then we're going to switch over to audience. Oh.
One thought I had is I think there are places, for example, Earl Boyle, the work that Swati Adarkar had done in Oregon, where they really created intentionally sort of a pre-K through 3 using data approaches. I think we can go and look for those examples. They existed before the pandemic and still now, and draw from them. But one of the things I just wanted to offer up, Laura, is I feel like part of the challenge here is we're not connecting this work into the heart of what schools are accountable for. Schools have to improve their outcomes. Most schools are in 36 states plus DC have chronic absence as an accountability metric. And if we think that one of the antidotes to chronic absence is engagement, is better learning, and kindergarten chronic absence, believe me, it's an all-time high. This is a moment in time when I think people have to be leaning into the things that educators already feel responsible for, principals feel responsible for. They have to produce, and then they have to think about, well, how would using more music, using more singing, using more environmental learning, how would family engagement change the outcomes that I have and build that into their strategies for school improvement? Because we can't get into the central dialogue and make sure that principals see this as part of their responsibility. We can't create new strategies at scale.
I totally agree. And this could lead to another 30, 40 minute or longer conversation around like how to redesign accountability systems. So for another day, but there have been some really good audience questions that have come in, and some of you have answered them, but I want to invite in the Q&A box, but I want to invite, others to comment. One was about getting parents and guardians to really participate in their children's education, starting in pre-K, kindergarten, and how to carry that up. And Sharisa, you responded with kind of reframing the question. So I invite you to, just speak a little bit about that, and welcome anyone else to respond as well.
Yeah, I really thought a lot about my response to that question. And I think it's a question that we often get, and it's related to what Hetty presented on absenteeism. How do you get children to come to school? How do you get parents to participate in their child's education? And so I just wanted to think about how we're framing that and think about the pieces that we're talking about here and what are the responsibilities of the schools and the teachers and the educators in that bi-directional relationship. And so families and children are entering into an institution, into schools, and into classrooms that have their own sort of rules and mindsets and ambiance. And so how do we make that inviting, for children and families, so that the relationship is built? And it's not about participation. It's more about, I haven't heard from that parent in a couple of weeks. Something must be going on. I will reach out to that parent and see what's going on. And so those relationships, as we talked about, are really important. So others might want to add to that.
I think just finding all of the ways to invite parents in, more diverse ways to invite parents in. I know that even myself, as a motivated parent who feels they're pretty involved, the PTA meeting just isn't the thing that draws me in, and I think you have to meet people where they are and play to their strengths and interests. Just as you have to do that with children, you have to do that with parents too. We see a lot more engagement, diverse engagement. I think, as I mentioned, when some of our programs host community build days, for instance, for elements of their outdoor play and learning environments, because it speaks to a whole different skill set than someone who's comfortable necessarily sitting in a classroom talking about all the curriculum that their child will be going through. If they can come and use their hands and be hands-on with their child and demonstrate the great resource that they bring to their community in a totally different way. We've tapped into a different set of strengths. And so I think the many ways that we can look to the strengths of our parent communities and say, just like we want to ignite the passion for children and talk about what's magnetic for children, what's magnetic for the parents, it's not always sitting for a slideshow, you know, about the schedule for the year and that kind of thing. So, and sometimes it's sharing those cultural experiences, shared meals. I mean, just the way that we build community outside of schools, we can share community inside of our school settings as well.
Thanks. Okay, we had another question that Anne, you responded to, I think, in the box, but I'll open this up and expand it a little bit. This came from an anonymous listener, and they write, where does the modern research fall in the age-old reading wars debate, and how can phonics be integrated into culturally resonant methods of learning? And so I'll open that up to anyone who would want to respond. And you can comment on what you said in the chat as well.
Well, I've recently, over the last year, reached to national reading experts. And yes, there's lots going on, the big, huge reading debate. So it is the way children are being taught to read, but we're more interested in prenatal through age 5 in enabling the brain for reading. And when you talk about phonological awareness, well, what is that? That's awareness of sounds of a language, whatever that language is. How does that happen? Well, when we look at brain science about how the brain actually processes sound, we see that children cannot even maybe hear the difference between a B and a D. So if you go, and they can't hear it in their brain, they're not going to be able to, that's phonological awareness. So maybe neurologically they're not even at that point. So to me, auditory processing is a hidden missing link to language acquisition and to literacy. And so phonics and the phonics debate, of course, teachers are going to have to teach phonics, and the kindergarten teachers we're working with are teaching phonics. Of course, we know language and literacy is very many components to that. But if there's a beginning of this, it's brain development before they even get to school. Because about 1/3 of children seem to learn to read, no matter whether they're taught in whatever ways, shapes, and forms. They tend to learn. That is a little strange. 2/3 of children need to be intentionally taught language. And then reading is not natural to the brain. Singing, language is naturally, genetically there at birth. So we need to develop that so that when reading starts, reading actually has to grow the dendrites, grow the neural connections from sight to sound. They're not there. So if that sound isn't well developed, you're growing those pathways to what? So this is our main concern about children not hearing as much maybe language in the home. They're not hearing song. Song is just stories with pitch and rhythm. So how do they develop vocabulary? Pre-phonological awareness. I mean, we talked even about listening to bird sounds by going outside. Distinguishing different bird sounds is pre-phonological awareness, and it's all happening and developing all at the same time. We can't see in here, but the sound mind is vast and we're missing it because it's invisible to us. It's like the wind. You can't see it, but you can see the effects of it in children not being able to process sound well. I know this sounds strange because people keep talking about how do you use singing to teach blah, blah, blah. I'm saying, well, no, singing is a sound processing activity. So all of that to say, I think we've got to back it down and look really closely at the underpinnings of brain development.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question? Thanks, Anne. If you've all been very busy in the box answering lots of good questions, so I'm gonna take the moderator prerogative and ask you one more question before we close out here, because I think it's an important one. We've talked about a lot at the school level, but I want to hear from you. If you could, have states or even the federal government do one thing to really support educators differently in making changes around, attendance or being more culturally responsive, what would you like to see from the state or the federal government to better support the learning at kindergarten that we know kids really need? I see some head nods. Who would like to start? I see Anne. Okay, make it quick.
It's very quick. I wrote it out. State officials can pass policies and programs that require active bodies on, voices on environments for kindergartners. They could provide funding for teachers to learn how to create those environments, because teachers don't even know how to do that. And teachers could develop these pre-literacy skills through play and active learning and it could be supported by policy.
Thanks. Sure.
Yeah, I think in some ways we need more autonomy. I think that sometimes educators, there's some that mentioned it in the chat that felt like they were doing what was best for children and families, having a play-based environment, but it wasn't supported. And so sometimes there's policies and laws that really restrict that. I think sometimes that there needs to be more autonomy, which I know is difficult when we have testing and we have other expectations that need to happen. And I think maybe connecting it to some other things like attendance or other markers to show that schools are trying different ways to engage families is important. But there's a lot of different things I'm thinking of that are floating around in my head too, but I'll just stop there and let others have input as well.
Hetty?
So this is not just limited to policymakers, but I think we need to invest in much more communities of practice for kindergarten teachers, where they take a look at their data, they look at their practice, and they reflect on what needs to change. It is so much easier to say, I should do this, than to actually do it. So if, like what Anne and Rebecca are saying is, you can do what you're supposed to do, but use these tools as you carry it out. That's so much easier said than actually done. And kindergarten teachers need chances to connect with each other, look at that, and be informed by data on chronic absence, on suspensions, on whatever else is going on in their classroom, so they can assess whether they're engaging their kids and their families better, and then continually look and do that over time.
I think the only thing that I will add to that is that in our work with states, as we think about system leaders in their sphere of influence, we think about these 6 domains around how are we using data, how are we building capacity, to Hetty's point, what is our policy and funding, all of those different domains. And we're seeing states doing some really interesting things to ground their policy and their funding and the ways that they influence practice in the science of learning and development, so that in early childhood education, they're making those 2 silos of early childhood learning and K-12 more aligned and coherent. And they're creating incentives through policy and funding for practice that is grounded in the science of learning and development and prioritizes and emphasizes playful learning in the early years.
Last word, Rebecca?
I'll just say that I think the focus on social and emotional health is so key and critical to so many of the challenges that we're facing as a society in general. And I think that schools are obviously no stranger to those challenges. And so I think seeing it as a state and federal issue to embrace things that support social and emotional development and mental health in the context where children spend most of their time is so key to any kind of academic learning that will happen, but just for building healthy, resilient adults who can survive in this world today. So I think, you know, an emphasis there on raising folks to be resilient, and so we don't lose people along the way, right? So creating that stronger embrace of the whole child, and that we're setting up success not just around these academic markers, but around success for life. It's really key.
Thank you, and thanks to you all. And Hilary, I will turn it over back to you.
Thank you, and to each of you, our guests, for this time in this conversation today as we talk about absences and creating a school experience to support these students who are struggling through these real relationships and through time and through play and through interaction with peers and active learning, whether that's music or outdoor spaces. But we want to say thank you for joining us. To our audience, thank you for joining us in session 4 of our webinar series. Sign up the link I shared just a bit ago in the chat so that you can join session 5, which will be March 7th. And we'd love to hear you come and learn more about what's going on in kindergarten. We also have several other sessions coming up on February 21st at 12:30 p.m. Sarah just shared the link for Remake Learning, philanthropic opportunities for enhancing local learning landscapes. And on February 28th at 2:30, we have Preventing Burnout and #Resignation, investing in teacher coaching and support. And so again, links are in the chat for registration. Please take a moment and fill out a questionnaire if you haven't. And thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.